Number 10. An ancient murder. An ancient murder from over 4,000 years ago has finally been solved by archaeologists. The murder scene was first discovered in a Spanish cave. Researchers came across a group of skeletons from the late Neolithic period in 1999. The skeletons had clearly been murdered, then dumped deep inside the cave. 18 bodies were found here, along with 1,332 bone fragments. Using modern technology, scientists have finally come up with a cause of death. They know that there were two types of traumas exhibited by the skeletons: blunt force and sharp force. In other words, these people were brutally beaten and stabbed to death. Scientists have now identified the brutal murder weapon used in these killings. They believe the weapon was a large stone axe, likely sharpened to a point on one end so that it could be used for stabbing as well as beating. However, scientists are still looking for a motive for these barbarous killings. They blame interpersonal violence, but nobody knows what would have caused someone to go on a murder rampage with their trusty stone axe. Number 9. Bishop with a baby. Researchers at the Lund University Hospital in Sweden were shocked when they conducted a CT scan on a Scandinavian bishop from the year 1679 and discovered he had a tiny fetus tucked underneath his feet. Nobody knew just what to make of the bizarre discovery, as it's not every day that a mummified bishop's body would be found harboring a tiny unborn child. But after years of mystery, researchers have finally made some progress. First, we need to know who this bishop was. His name was Peder Winstrup, a prominent figure in Scandinavian history and one of the original fathers of Lund University. He was buried beneath a cathedral in Lund and became naturally mummified because of the plant material used to build his coffin. And because he had died over a long period of illness, by the time he was finally buried, he was practically a mummy anyway. But where did the fetus come from? It was obviously concealed beneath his feet on purpose. Researchers now know that there was a direct connection between the bishop and the child, and that the fetus may have been placed underneath his feet in secret by whoever organized his funeral. DNA evidence has shown that the fetus was probably the bishop's grandson. They shared 25% of their DNA. It's likely that the child's mother, after having a stillbirth, secreted the fetus into the coffin with the bishop in hopes that the child would be close to its grandfather in death. Number 8. The mysterious unicorn. A new fossil discovery has shed some light on the mythical unicorn. While most of us believe white horses with horns growing out of their foreheads are just myths, the truth is that they may have actually been inspired by real unicorn creatures. This fossil was discovered in Kazakhstan, belonging to a prehistoric animal with a single horn that walked across our planet at the same time as humans. It dates back 29,000 years to before modern civilization, but to a time when human beings were still communicating with one another. Scientists have called it the Elasmotherium sibiricum, or the Siberian unicorn for short. The creature is closely related to a rhinoceros, but its horn was significantly longer. Scientists say its horn could have been several feet long, and while it wasn't a magical white stallion that could shoot rainbows, it likely fascinated our ancient ancestors enough that they told stories about the Siberian unicorn. Those amazing stories have made it all the way to us in modern times. Number 7. King Arthur's Court. Camelot was the place where King Arthur held court at his round table. Most of us accept the stories of King Arthur as legends, but others have taken the tales a little more seriously. Experts have been wondering for decades just how real Camelot and King Arthur really were. Was he a real king? Did Camelot really exist? Depending on which expert you ask, the mystery has actually been solved already. The primary contender for the real-life location of Camelot is Caerleon in South Wales. Two experts of British history, Geoffrey of Monmouth and Chrétien de Troyes, have Camelot placed at this very spot. Back in the 5th century, this was one of 3 Roman forts still standing in Britain. To understand the significance of this a bit better, keep in mind that the Welsh people of today are descendants of the Roman Britons who were pushed out of what is now England by the Anglo-Saxon invaders in the 5th century. The few descendants of the old Roman settlers were forced across the border, right to where Carlion is, and considering many historians believe King Arthur was a real leader of the Roman British people fighting against the invaders, it makes sense that he had used this place as his fortress. Through the years, Arthur and Camelot simply became more legendary than they really were. If Camelot truly did exist, it was almost certainly here at Carlion. Number 6. Mystery of the Hermit King. For the past few centuries, archaeologists haven't paid much attention to a particular bizarre cave dwelling in Britain. To be honest, they thought it was an ornamental building made as a joke back in the 18th century. It wasn't until just recently that the mystery of the cave dwelling was solved. As it turns out, the cave really was used as a house. In fact, it was built for a mysterious hermit king after he was exiled and forced to live alone in the wilderness. And it wasn't in the 18th century. It was 1200 years ago. The mystery actually has two parts. There's the cave, then there's the legend of King Eardwulf of Northumbria. Legend says that the king was chased away from his throne for mysterious reasons in 806 AD, then banished to live in a cave for the rest of his life. He died in 830 AD and was buried 5 miles from the cave. It wasn't until now that archaeologists connected the cave and the story of King Eardwulf. Edmund Simmons, an archaeologist from the Royal Agricultural University, believes the king lived out his final days in the cave under the ever-present eyes of his enemies. It wasn't as great as being a king, but at least he had his own house. Number 5. Fire and Brimstone. The ancient Middle Eastern city of Tal el-Hammam, as it's known today, was wiped out 3,600 years ago. Up until recently, nobody had really known what exactly happened to this ancient city. It looked as if it had been destroyed by a sudden earthquake or an exploding volcano, but there was just no way to tell what caused the abrupt deaths of everyone in the city, ruining the buildings and blanketing the town in fire. But now, the mystery has been solved. Experts in asteroid impacts stepped up to solve the case. They now believe that the ancient town was wiped out by a sudden asteroid strike, and that the event inspired the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The strike would have been similar to the one that killed the dinosaurs, just significantly smaller. The piece of spare rock probably exploded as a fireball 2.5 miles above the ancient city. Even though it didn't hit the city, the blast would have been 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped in Hiroshima. Everyone in the city was blinded immediately. The air temperature rose to 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit and the city was basically melted. At the same time, wind from the blast would have swept through the city streets of Jericho, 14 miles away. Experts believe that when the citizens of Jericho went to investigate the blast and found the entire city gone, as if snuffed out by a great god's fist, this is what inspired the story of the city of Sodom that eventually made its way into the Bible. Number 4. How the pyramids were built. Archaeologists believe they have finally solved the mystery of how the Great Pyramids of Egypt were built. The mystery was solved thanks to a simple discovery: a ramp from 4,500 years ago. According to the researchers with the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology, as well as experts with the University of Liverpool, the ramp was used to move huge blocks of alabaster. These alabaster blocks were cut from the slopes of a quarry, then moved using the ramps. It was actually quite simple. On each side of the ramp would be a flight of stairs where huge wooden posts were positioned. The ramp then acted like a sled with ropes fixed to the wooden posts. Workers could pull the blocks up or down the ramp using the wooden poles, ropes, and the power of gravity. With this simple method, they would have been able to easily move heavy stones up large inclines, hence getting giant pieces of rock to the top of the pyramids with relative ease. Number 3. The origin of the Sarsen stones. Speaking of huge rocks, researchers believe they've also solved the mystery of where the Stonehenge building materials came from. The actual megalithic stones used in the construction of this ancient sanctuary are called Sarsen stones. Archaeologists were able to pinpoint the source of these stones about 15 miles away from Stonehenge. They did it by analyzing the chemical composition of the stones, then comparing their findings to the chemical composition of a crop of similar stones. The huge pieces of material, some of which weigh over 20 tons and stand over 21 feet tall, came from an area known as Marlborough Downs. Discovering the origin of the stones has only solved one part of the larger mystery though. Researchers still don't know what Stonehenge was used for exactly, or how they carried the stones to the building site from 15 miles away. Maybe they used ramps similar to what the ancient Egyptians had, but that mystery is still being investigated. What do you think it was used for? Let us know in the comments below. Number 2. The Kennewick Man. The identity of the Kennewick Man has finally been solved. The mystery was ongoing for almost 2 decades, ever since a pair of youngsters stumbled upon a human skull inside the Columbian River in Kennewick, Washington. What first seemed to be the head of a murder victim turned into one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Here's why the skull was such a mystery. It had very unusual characteristics, so unusual that nobody could figure out where the man came from or why he was there. Scientists were divided, some believing he came from Japan and others saying he was Polynesian. There were even some that claimed Europe as a point of origin, but the skull was found to be 9,500 years old, so none of these theories were readily accepted. But thanks to dedicated archaeologists like James Chatters, who was involved with the discovery, we now know exactly where the Kennewick Man came from. The experts used DNA sequencing to reveal that he was a Native American. This honestly makes the most sense, as anything else would have drastically changed what we know about North American history. However, researchers still don't know why he had such unusual features. They've actually managed to reconstruct his face based on his skull, and despite having Native American blood, he didn't look anything like a Native American. He must have seemed like an alien to his own people, born with totally different features than everyone else around him. Or maybe he was an alien. Number 1. The Antikythera Mechanism. The Antikythera Mechanism has been a mystery to scientists ever since it was discovered at the bottom of the sea by sponge divers in the year 1901. The mechanism had been on a merchant ship that sank off the coast of Greece 2,000 years ago. When the sponge divers found the ship, they looted as much treasure from it as possible. The most bizarre relic was the Antikythera Mechanism, which has gained significant fame in modern times because it looks like it came from an ancient computer. People have speculated that this rusty green piece of metal was once part of a larger, more complex computer developed by either incredibly intelligent ancient people or aliens. But the mystery of the mechanism has finally been solved. Because so much of the mechanism was missing, it was a lot of work piecing it back together again to recreate what it used to look like. But engineering experts from University College London have now built a working replica of the actual machine that the mechanism broke apart from. According to Adam Wojcik, one of the scientists working on the project, the mechanism was just a simple calendar. Well, maybe not that simple. The mechanism tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and 5 planets. However, the mechanism's designers assumed that these objects revolve around the Earth, so their movements are far from correct. Basically, the mechanism was just a fancy astrological calendar, similar to a modern watch. Are there any ancient mysteries you're still waiting for scientists to solve? Let us know in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, be sure to hit subscribe, and don't forget to come back for another awesome video. See you next time, bye!